Stephen Meade again, back with another Bullseye Guy podcast. Exciting times, a lot going on. We're watching changes on a daily basis, and I love looking forward in the entrepreneurial side, but sometimes we have to go backwards. Where I live in Beverly Hills, a lot of times I live one block from X, and X is a landmark that's very famous, and it's famous due to Gary Goldstein. I'm not going to give it away, but we're going to have a great interview. Excited for the introduction to Gary. Film, entertainment, entrepreneur. We're going to kind of cover the arc. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. Gary, great seeing you. Thanks so much. Don't you love my intros? Like, you don't know where they're coming from.
The best intro I've ever had.
Live close to a landmark, famous for Gary. Introduce yourself, Gary. A lot of people probably know your work. They may or may not know your name, but give us a little background on Gary Goldstein from the beginning.
You mean when it all started when I was a child?
Well, as quickly as we can accelerate through, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll go backwards. So I spent the majority of my time, I moved to LA in the early 80s to get into the film business. Prior to that, I was a hippie in San Francisco. I grew up there, went to UC Berkeley, produced all the music concerts for the campus, did some A&R for Columbia Records, the big lion of the labels at the time. Thought I was going into music. Basically, I was that kid at a very young age who fell into books and story and fell in love with storytelling, and that's been my life. So music was one version of that, but it wasn't a great fit. So I took a left turn, became a criminal defense attorney, working in the ghetto of San Francisco for a foundation that represented the indigent adults of that geography, along with other services to mend the fabric of the community. It was a great experience. I did that, but I realized being a romantic, that was a bit harsh day to day. And so I packed up whatever fit in my Carmen Ghia Volkswagen, headed south to break into the film business in Los Angeles. And I've been here ever since. I started the first 10, 12 years I was here, I opened up my own literary management company representing basically unknown. I was unknown. My clients were unknown, representing very talented but unknown writers and directors and breaking them into the business. In 1988, the writers went on strike and it lasted almost a year. So I took one of my young clients and said, you want to direct, I want to produce, dust off a college script. We're going to go out. I'm going to raise a little bit of money. We made a film, caught the bug big time. And I basically dissolved the management company in favor of becoming a full-time producer, which is what I've done primarily ever since. And of course, Stephen, you know my first film. Well, I know you know yes. It by heart. It's called Cannibal Women in the Avocado Jungle of Death.
That may be why I'm not a big fan of avocados, or why I am. Depends. I'll have to see that one. But let's talk about, before we get into some of the more famous producing side, which, again, what was your interest around music and entertainment at that standpoint? And then what was the difference between music and film and storytelling when you started moving into it? Let's start there. What was the interest around music?
Well, back in the late 60s, I went to UC Berkeley starting in 68 to 72. So as a generation at that time, our sort of job was to unseat a president and end a war. And a lot of what was going on, Stephen, as you know, was reflected primarily through the music of the day. The poet laureates, it was Bob Dylan, it was Joni Mitchell, it was all these amazing artists who were talking about what was going on. And I loved music to begin with, but it just spoke to me. They were the storytellers in that moment, along with the great filmmakers of the 70s and 80s. Those were the two things that really called to me. So I just loved the music. And when I got to UC Berkeley, shy though I was, they had all these venues, including a 3,000 seat brand new auditorium that was amazing. And I just walked into the admin building and said, who produces your concerts? And they said, we don't have that title. I said, great, how about I do it? And I did it with a friend, the two of us. So we were bringing in Joni Mitchell and all these amazing people. And it really was a wonderfully surprising experience in the middle of all the tumult and the riots and the, whatnot, the protests, to be working with these artists and getting to know them and seeing sort of the world through the lens of their music. It was just a very exciting thing for me.
And the terms, Gary, I've always struggled with entertainment. You said something interesting because, again, the movie producer where you moved into, we'll get there. You said you started producing the concerts. Were you producing them or promoting them, or what's the difference between producing and promoting on the music side before we talk about the movie side?
Well, back then it was really, it was all sort of, I never thought of it as different functions because we would identify the artists that we most wanted to have on our stages.
Okay.
Whether they were big concerts like the Joni Mitchell or smaller ones like Phil Oakes and Hoyt Axton and all these great acts. And we would decide who we wanted, reach out to their representatives, their labels, whomever, book them, bring them in, make sure that the concert was being promoted, produced, if you will, and flowed accordingly. But of course, part of that was making sure the radio stations and the campus newspaper and the larger regional newspapers all knew about these events. So it was kind of a little mishmash of all of it, to be honest.
So it's like in the movie world, it would be attaching talent.
Yeah.
Securing talent. All right. I've always struggled with the hierarchy of entertainment and how it works. All right. So your first movie, Avocado. Talk to me about the first movie, because this apparently started you on a career that I think moved up from there.
Well, Stephen, the big takeaway for me from that was, nature abhors a vacuum. And when the writers go on strike and shut all of production across film and television down for a year, you have to see it as an opportunity. You don't sit on your hands. And so we just took advantage. We actually, from the day that I went shopping for money, I raised $200,000 from one guy. And when I said to my collaborator, who was the writer, who was going to be also the writer-director, I've got this much money. He said, God, that sounds like a lot of money. Let's go. And of course, we didn't know. We were dumb and dumber in the film business. We just had no concept of how this would play out. So I said, okay, let's go, but we'll wait, because 4 weeks from now, we need to be in Utah at the Sundance Institute for the production lab, because I was going as the producer. The same fellow was going as the writer of a script called 3000 that would later become Pretty Woman. So we had to be in Utah 4 weeks hence. And I said, well, we'll do it as soon as we get back. And he said, no, I don't want it hanging over my head. Let's do it before we go. And both of us thought that was perfectly reasonable. So bottom line, in 4 weeks, we did pre-production, production, edited, post-produced the film, and delivered the film the morning we were getting on a plane to go to Utah. Suffice to say, we made every mistake known to man when it comes to filmmaking. But the happy news is that we actually got it done. Like I said, after that, it was like, oh gosh, this is such a more delicious, big challenge than representing people, which I also loved. But I knew that my future was going to go in the direction of being storyteller as producer, not as championing the careers of younger talent.
Got it. And so was the second movie, you just dropped a nugget in there. There's something behind the scenes of 3000. When you said that, I thought it was going to be the movie, the 300, but you dropped a nugget. So was your next movie the one we mentioned? What was your second movie?
The second movie was a little micro budget, no to low budget film called Pizza Man, also starring Bill Maher. We got really great cast for these no budget films. The second one was Pizza Man, and the third film, ironically, because back in the day, the goal was always grow your career from little independent, cut your teeth, get some experience, and then matriculate into the studio filmmaking realm, right, working with the major studios. And I had a film that I thought was going to be a few $1 million independent film Because back then, unlike the streamers of today, we had the equivalent, which was 25 or 30 very robust independent companies who made smaller budgeted films than the major studios. So this film that I had called 3000, I thought would be an indie. And I optioned it, I'll keep this story short. I optioned it to a couple of different companies. It was in the doldrums. I sent it as a writing sample to a friend of mine who was a senior vice president at Touchstone Pictures, which is the sister label to Disney.
Yeah.
Their so-called, at that time, their new adult label. And I sent him the script saying, you're going to fall in love with this writer. We're going to come and pitch you a week from now a couple of Disney appropriate stories. This one is about a prostitute. It's not for Disney.
Right.
And a few days later, they called back and said, we want to buy it. We went out for a meeting several days later and walked into a room with 24 human beings in it, which normally you're meeting with one, maybe two executives, and that's it. It was the chairman, Jeffrey Katzenberg. It was the president of the studio. It was the senior vice president that I'd sent the script to. It was Gary Marshall and his people. It was New Regency, the indie that I'd optioned the project to, and all of their executives. There were all these people, casting director, line producer. The room was like a party. And what I learned over the course of the meeting was, and this is a really beautiful thing, whether you're in a creative field or not, you never know what's going on the other side of the conversation, right? So it happens that there was a wonderful film that we all love called What About Bob? Well, that film originally did not star Bill Murray. It starred Michael Keaton, and Michael Keaton's deal had gone awry. It went off the rails.
Okay.
So now they had Gary Marshall and the line producer and the whole production team, a soundstage, everything, and no film. So they looked at ours and said, well, it's a little bit dark. It's a little bit, not what we want. But if we could lighten the tone, we'll just slap this in and Gary Marshall will direct it.
Wow. Timing. What was the premise of the name 3000? And then obviously the big reveal will be, tell us what the name was, even though you dropped it. Where was 3000? And then how did the new name come up? Because that's the famous name that everybody knows on that film.
Sure. Well, the original was called 3000 spelled out. The number of dollars that Edward hands Vivian, that the lead character hands.
Got it.
For her companionship for the week. And it was set in Hollywood and Beverly Hills. And this is where the writer lived. The writer lived in a one-room studio apartment facing on an alley in the Rampart district, a very then colorful, I'd say almost difficult, if not dangerous neighborhood. And his view on the world was, oh gosh, working girls and police and homeless and drugs and, all that. And against that backdrop, he was a young writer I just started working with. I said, your college scripts are great, but they're quirky. Write a romance, comedy or drama. And he did, knowing that I wanted it in like modest locations so I could do it for a small budget.
Okay.
And he brought back a script that was so poignant and so realistic and so, it was one of the best first drafts I've ever read at the time. And I said, this is amazing. So at the end, boy doesn't get girl. It was very different from the film that we came to know later, but the characters were absolutely fascinating. The world was fascinating. And so that was the script that I went out with. When it got set up at Disney, unexpectedly, the question that was asked is, on the Disney likeness scale, it's a 4, can you make it a 7? And I immediately said, yes, we know how to do that.
Right.
Right?
How the heck am I going to do that?
Right. But that's the only appropriate answer. Sure. And then everyone got jubilant and off we were. We made a deal, off to the races. Long story short, the title, we knew from the get-go that we needed a new title. 3000 just numbers don't work and generally, and it doesn't tell the audience what to expect. As we went through the film and we started putting music together, samples of different kinds of tracks that we would want in the movie, along with the score, Jeffrey Katzenberg came forward and said, I think we should call it Pretty Woman. And the reason is because we were looking for a title track that really summed up the character. And once we decided on the song, then we just took the title as the title of the film. And a lot of people, and quite frankly, it took me a minute too. At the beginning, I was like, Pretty Woman, oh my gosh, no. And the beautiful thing is that Roy Orbison had just died. And the 10 most popular artists, David Bowie, all the big artists of the day refused to do a cover version. So we had to pay more money and buy the original.
Wow, okay.
And that's how we came by that name.
Wow. So my joke and where I started this was when I tell people where I live, I'm like, oh, Beverly Hills, I'm a block and a half from the Pretty Woman Hotel. You're like, oh my God, I love that movie. I mean, there's times, Gary, I'm sitting halfway around the world thinking, oh, I'm with people that love Gary Goldstein. Should I call you? And I think once or twice I'm like, hey, Gary, here, talk to this person. You know, so yeah, Pretty Woman was obviously an amazing and iconic film. And I love the backstory on it because people don't know those things. What was the biggest surprise for you out of how successful the movie became?
Well, several things. One, the level of success alone has got to surprise anyone, whether you're involved with the film or not. It's just like for a film to 30 years later be so celebrated, give so much joy, literally around the globe, it plays everywhere, is literally a dream come true for anyone, let alone a producer. It would be true for an executive or a writer or actor. So that's already amazing. I think the thing that there were a couple of really big surprises. I had Julia Roberts attached for 3 years before we shot the film at Disney, when it was just a little indie.
Okay.
And I met her because I saw her in friends of mine produced a little film, a beautiful film ensemble pick called Mystic Pizza. And Mystic Pizza, when I saw it, it was like, I had no criticism for my friends. I just said, I want to meet this girl, whoever she is. She's Vivian, and I need to know her. So they introduced me.
Wow.
So Julia was attached for 3 years, but here's the surprise. Julia had filmed, by the time we were going into production, she had already filmed Steel Magnolias, but it had not yet been released. Julia at that time was unknown really to the American public in a meaningful way. And the same could be said for the executives who populated the major studio C-suites. They didn't really know her. So the idea of having her as the lead in a major studio, and it wasn't a major studio, it was a major studio, but it was a low budget film by their standards. We were a little tiny studio film, but they didn't want an unknown in the lead. Richard Gere had turned the project down previously. And so I thought, but this is my dream cast. This is the couple. And Richard had said no, studio didn't want her. They were screen testing every breathing name, actor and actress. You know, it's all very public information. Michelle Pfeiffer, Al Pacino, like the list is very long.
Wow.
And many of them, fortunately, quite a number of them were made offers, male and female, and they all turned it down for different reasons. Magically, we threaded the needle because finally, with a big studio, a big checkbook, a major director, which I'd never had, we finally were fortunate to get Richard to say yes. And once Richard said yes, I asked Gary Marshall to meet Julia. And when Gary Marshall says to the studio, I met this really interesting gal, and I want her to screen test with Richard, that happens. And once you have that evidence, an incendiary moment on film as a screen test, that brought it all together. But the idea that I would ever actually see Julia and Richard, my dream actor and actress leads, be hired for this film was the biggest surprise of all. But the other really big surprise, and I take no credit for it, it wasn't my inspiration, but the fact that we inherited Gary Marshall, he became the director of our film, was like an inspiration from God, you know.
Amazing.
You don't expect those things.
Yeah, well, let's move pretty quickly. I mean, that's obviously congratulations, iconic. Mothman Prophecies, Under Siege, a couple other, big films. Share with me any kind of insights on those, because I want to move forward to the entrepreneurial side of Gary Goldstein today. So any sort of tidbits or interesting behind the scenes or surprises from either of those movies or other ones that you did that you may want to mention?
No, I mean, I think the thing that the one thing I would say is about Mothman Prophecies, never say die, because that was a film that every studio and every mini major and every independent company had seen and passed on long before I got it. But when I read it, Stephen, that film was very reminiscent for me of my experience for the 24 months following the unexpected death of my own dad. We were very, very close. And when he passed unexpectedly, I had these very, I would dare say, paranormal or unexpected experiences consistently for quite a while. And when I read that script for the Mothman Prophecies, it just knocked me out. So I decided, come hell or high water, I was going to try and get that film made privately as an homage to my dad, but because it really had such an impact on me.
Okay.
And so I won't bore you with the long story, but I managed to get it. The one company that was still not the only company I could find that hadn't passed on it was a company I respected, Lakeshore, and I took it to them and they started to pass on it, and I said, I need an in-person meeting before you make a final decision. So I showed up in their office, and I never pitched them about they'd read the script, so I couldn't talk about that. So I just told them the story of my dad. And sometimes when you just come at something with such passion, you're articulate and say, look, humanity is wired to understand what kind of loss and despair associates with in this environment. And I can't think of an audience, a filmmaker, a lead actor who's not going to find this alluring. And in fact, they turned it around, changed their decision, said yes. And one of the biggest surprises of my career is getting to make a picture that meant so much to me personally, unexpectedly.
And so this is in the entertainment world. This is our segue, I believe it's called, or transition. Because again, what you talk about, Gary, there's a lot of entrepreneurial lessons in there in terms of, a core belief and not giving up on an idea. And, one of the sayings I have, people make decisions emotionally and defend them logically, and when you gave an emotional appeal, then logically, the executives are able to defend that decision. And you having a dream team and a belief, like there's so many entrepreneurial characteristics that I can pull out from the business side, not the entertainment, but it's the same parallel. What was your transition from entertainment to some of the business world and things you're doing now?
Well, every film is a startup, Stephen. So it is a very entrepreneurial undertaking, and the stakes are very high because you're spending a lot of money on these kinds of films, dozens of millions of dollars often. So you have to be able to share a vision in such a compelling way that you attract the right, populate it appropriately, that you steer it down a certain course. You build a certain entrepreneurial muscle like you do in any industry, no different than any other industry. And along the way, over time, I would get asked to come into, whether it's a startup or a slightly more mature company, for purposes of discussing strategy or internal and external communications, storytelling. And I always loved it because I'm very curious, and it doesn't matter how much I know about that business or their sector. It's almost liberating not to know. I come in with a fresh mind. But I've always enjoyed working with people who are not of and from Hollywood, and helping them in their enterprise. And then I've been a part of a couple of startups myself over time. But I like building things. It's what lights me up. I'm a fire starter. I'm really not a good operator or admin person, except at the beginning. Like I have a good 6 to 12 month run, and then I'm moving on. So business is actually a really phenomenally wonderful and interesting culture for me to dip my toe into from time to time. No different than, say, real estate. I told you earlier, I'm rehabbing a property. I'm doing, I like juggling things. I like having a diverse menu as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
It keeps me fresh. So yeah, I love all things business.
And so the transition, I know you were working on one thing. I'll throw the word out there because I don't know if you are still, but for a little while I was getting emails from you on chocolate. There was a passion project around chocolate that I think when I spoke to you again, may have moved on. So talk to me either about the chocolate project, if it's still relevant, or what you're up to now in terms of the entrepreneurial activity.
The chocolate project it was called Choco Libre, and it was
Yes.
it intended to be a sort of a luxury curated experience of the kinds of things you're not going to find at your Whole Foods or other shops in your city. These were the best. We wanted to do for chocolate what others had done for specialty foods, whether it was wine or tea or tequila or whatever it might have been, and really begin to introduce the brand, the story of the chocolate maker behind this amazing brand that is in the US or abroad or whatever. And America had become sort of the epicenter of the new the new chefs of chocolate.
Okay.
And so it didn't carry on, and there's a reason, because sometimes, and this is really important in terms of entrepreneurship, is it turned out I didn't think it was true. I thought we understood that what we were creating was really I wanted to do a grassroots startup. I wanted to create an experience that was so alluring, and we had tested it. We did these gatherings of 30 plus people, and we'd take them through the history and the mythology and stories about chocolate and the particular. We'd have tastings like a flight of chocolates with pairings. It was just, people loved it, and they left with new best friends, and they brought people alive. And I wanted to continue to do that and sell little boxes of, like grassroots, like I said, just really simple, with literature about the chocolate, educating people. And my partner had a different vision, which is not better or worse, right or wrong, but he wanted to do a very expensive, very pristine, beautifully, expensively packaged box with all sorts of accoutrement, and sell it on a quarterly basis online, and not have an in-person sort of experience. So I basically, after a year, once we launched the first box, I stepped aside, because it really wasn't, the joy for me was the gatherings.
Yeah.
And so I stepped aside. I'll tell you, I've got one of my enterprises today, which will surprise you because it surprises me, is that I'm in the fragrance business. A friend of mine for many, many years, like a sister, she's fabulous. And she's been in with a company in the beauty space, but decided she wanted to create a fragrance based on something she had once experienced that inspired her. We found a way to hire one of the best noses in the business and replicate our version of that scent.
Wow. Okay.
The response is, I've never seen anything like it. Every single person that has experienced this scent is gaga. So we're early stages. But the other thing about the oil, it's essential oil based, and it's magnificent. And there's a wonderful through line, like we're calling it a celebration of self-love. And we have, the company's Pandia Beauty, and we have a name, Cosmic Love Oil. It's all this wonderful stuff. And of course, the story of two of our ingredients, the two ingredients that Cleopatra soaked the purple sails of all her ships in as she entered the port of Rome, sitting on her gold throne on a ship.
Storytelling.
And Mark Antony fell in love before she set foot on terra firma, and left his throne, left his position in Rome to go to Alexandria with this enchantress for the rest of his life. Neroli and jasmine, those two ingredients. There are two of 7 ingredients in ours. But it's a magnificent scent, and the innovation, because I said innovation's key. We got to do something that separates us from everybody in the beauty space. Is we're using sound frequencies. I have a wizard friend who's a magical being in the area of sound frequency, and he created a cocktail. It's a bunch of different frequencies put together with a very specific outcome, which enhances the effect. Everybody who wears this says it's the most heart-opening, like it changes their experience of their day. And we can measure it scientifically. It's fascinating. So we're doing a sound-infused essential oil fragrance, and hoping to, eventually make a splash in the beauty space.
So we're going to bump up against time, Gary, but again, and I can tell you're a little reticent when you say that. Gary, I've got friends that are in Ancient Aliens, Giorgio Tsoukalos, George Norrie. They did a fascinating one on sound, and different sounds, they put sand on top, and the sound creates actually geometric patterns, and those same patterns are on the Indian temples through time. Yes. So sound does create in nature a geometric outcome. It was fascinating when you watch this. So to have sound infused, there's some magic there. If done properly is amazing.
It harmonizes this down to the cellular level, as well as it harmonizes and beautifies sound.
Even the sound ohm creates a certain pattern, and that pattern has been shown in temples dating back thousands of years. So the sound infusion side, don't ever shy off from that. Those of us who know and appreciate it think it's amazing.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, that's very cool. So is it out now? Is the packaging done? Is the promotion done? Where are you in process, and how can we help?
We've just filled our first 1,000 bottles, our bottles, and we are doing the packaging. We have some branding. We may tweak it, but we're doing the packaging, and we're having some quiet, strategic conversations with, determining how do we want to launch, how do we want to roll this out, what's the right, what's the right path for us from a marketing perspective. Okay. But yeah, it's a fun time.
And is it going to be direct to consumer? You're going to go retail, celebrity influencer endorsement, or is that still all in process?
Tune in next week, folks.
Good, because by next week, I'm going to have another arrow in the quiver for you. I have somebody I'll send you after this.
Fabulous.
All right, my friend. Gary, amazing as always. I love the story. I mean, obviously, Pretty Woman, Mothman Prophecies, Under Siege were the big wins, but understanding what happens behind the scenes and what it takes to get a project. Most people see you at the end when you're successful, not all of the building that goes into it. So kudos on that, and go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but it's like any other entrepreneur, Stephen, and I know, we've all been there. Success and failure are the same creature. They're the twins that were never separated at birth. For every film I've gotten made, I've had at least 10 that never made it to the light of day. Easily.
Yeah, they're the failures aren't failures. They're just steps along the process. It's all a matter of perspective.
Amen.
All right. And with that, coming to you a block and a half from the Pretty Woman Hotel in Beverly Hills. All right, Gary, we're going to wrap up, buddy. Thank you so much.
Stephen, beautiful to see you.
All right. Stephen Meade, the Bullseye Guy. Tune in as always next week. More great guests, but Gary's fabulous as always. Talk to you soon.